The air was crisp, carrying with it a faint scent of pine and earth. Robert had always loved camping, a chance to escape the bustle of his everyday life and spend time in the stillness of nature. It was late autumn, and the woods were thick with the scent of fallen leaves, creating a blanket that muffled the sound of his footsteps as he made his way back to his small campsite. The fire had long since died down, and the only light came from the faint glow of the stars above and the half-moon peeking through the treetops. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as a chill set in, the quiet settling over him like a heavy weight. He had set up camp alone, a decision that now seemed a bit foolish, as the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and shift, their forms twisting in ways that seemed unnatural. The crackling of the embers from the fire had long since faded, and now only the whisper of the wind through the trees kept him company. He sat down on a nearby log, his eyes scanning the darkness as if waiting for something, though he couldn't have said what. The forest was a familiar place to him. He had camped here many times before, yet tonight something felt different. The usual peace he felt surrounded by nature was gone. It was replaced by an uneasy stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, but it was too quiet, too still. He didn't feel alone, but he couldn't place why. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, barely audible but unmistakable, a whisper. He sat up straight, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The voice had come from somewhere close, yet the trees around him stood silent, their branches unmoving. Robert's eyes darted around, searching the darkened forest for any signs of life, but there was nothing. The whisper came again, barely louder than the first time. It was faint, as if the forest itself was trying to speak to him. He shook his head, trying to shake the creeping feeling that was slowly wrapping itself around his mind. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the sound had been carried on the breeze, the trees whispering to one another in some strange, ancient language. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants, and moved to stoke the embers of his fire. But as he knelt down, the whisper came once more, this time unmistakable. "I'm here," it said. Robert froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was trying to speak to him from the darkness. His mind raced. Was it another camper? No, he was alone. The closest campground was miles away. His phone was dead, and the nearest town was too far to walk to in the dark. He was truly isolated. The whisper came again, this time a little clearer, almost as if it was right behind him. He could feel his skin crawl as the words repeated in his mind. "I'm here." Robert spun around, his eyes wide, scanning the trees, the shadows, the underbrush. His pulse hammered in his chest as the silence pressed down on him. There was nothing but the forest, dark and still. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, and all he could hear was the soft rustle of leaves and the faintest crackling of the dying fire. He let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his bones. It was nothing, just the wind, the forest playing tricks on him. He was alone, and there was no one here but him and the trees. But as he took a step forward, he heard it again, unmistakable, clear as day. "We're here." The voice was close, too close. Robert froze again, every muscle in his body tense, every instinct telling him to run. He turned in a slow circle, eyes darting back and forth, trying to make sense of the world around him. The whisper was louder now, as if it was coming from all directions, circling him, taunting him. "We're here," it repeated. The voice was almost familiar, a strange echo of his own thoughts, his own words. But that was impossible. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't said a word since arriving at the campsite earlier that day. Yet there it was, that eerie voice, repeating his own thoughts. Each time it spoke, it was as if it knew exactly what he was thinking, what he had done. It was a voice that seemed to know him better than he knew himself. Robert's heart raced. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching and twisting in the dim light. He backed up slowly, his eyes never leaving the trees. Something wasn't right. The air had thickened, heavy with an unnatural tension. He could feel the presence of something that wasn't there before. It was as if the forest was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He didn't know why, but he could sense that he was no longer alone. His breath quickened as the whispers grew louder. They started to overlap, as if more and more voices were joining in, layering over one another. Each one spoke his name. Each one repeated the words he had spoken earlier in the day, things he had said to himself in his own thoughts. It was as if the forest was mimicking him, mocking him. "We're here." The voices swirled around him, coming from every direction, each one like a cold hand on his back, a breath on his neck. His pulse quickened, his senses heightened, and yet the air remained thick with a sense of impending doom. The shadows seemed to pulse, bending unnaturally, twisting into forms that didn't belong in nature. The whispers grew louder. Now, they weren't just repeating his words, they were twisting them. Echoes of things he hadn't said, things that felt wrong, words that didn't belong to him. His mind raced to make sense of it, but the longer he listened, the more his thoughts unraveled like threads coming apart in a storm. Then, just as the whispers reached a fever pitch, they stopped. Silence, complete and utter silence. For a moment, Robert stood in the dark, his breath ragged, his eyes wide as they scanned the shadows. But nothing moved. The forest had fallen still. No sound, no whisper, no rustling leaves. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, making his skin prickle with anxiety. He wasn't alone. He could feel it, the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching him from every direction. Then finally, the last whisper came, and this one was different. "We're behind you." The words cut through the air like a blade, and Robert's blood ran cold. His heart skipped a beat, and his body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't alone. Whatever had been whispering to him wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was close, too close. Without thinking, Robert spun around, his body moving on instinct. But the forest was empty. The shadows remained still and unmoving. No one was there, no one at all. But the whispers had stopped. The night was silent once again. Robert stood frozen, his heart still pounding, a sense of dread filling his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps as he scanned the surrounding darkness, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The words, the whispers, they weren't just a trick of the wind. They were deliberate, clear, and they were coming from somewhere close. He slowly turned his body, trying to shake the sense of being watched. His feet felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding him in place, reluctant to let him move. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, every instinct telling him to run, but something else held him back, a cold, bone-deep curiosity. He reached into his jacket pocket, fingers trembling as he fumbled for his flashlight. The small beam of light flickered to life, casting weak, trembling shadows around him. He swept it across the ground, the trees, the underbrush, but nothing moved. Everything was still. But the silence, the unnatural stillness, pressed down on him like a weight. His mind raced. The whispers, they had sounded like him, mimicking his thoughts, repeating his words, things he'd said earlier in the day, things no one else could have known. How? Was someone out there? Someone hiding in the trees, watching him? Or was it something else entirely? Something worse? The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves high above, but it was different now. Sharper, colder. The forest felt alive in a way it never had before, as if something was moving beneath the surface, something that wasn't meant to be there. Robert's fingers tightened around the flashlight as he took a cautious step forward, his eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. The whispers had stopped, but the air still seemed thick, heavy, charged with an electric tension that made every step feel like a mistake. He tried to steady his breath to focus, but the sounds, the whispers, they wouldn't leave him. His mind replayed the words over and over again. "We're behind you." The thought of it made his stomach churn. The voices had been too close, too real. His pulse quickened, and he took another step, then another. With each step, the darkness seemed to press closer, the trees towering over him like ancient sentinels, blocking out the moonlight. The shadows moved, but he couldn't tell if they were real or if his mind was playing tricks on him. The silence was maddening. The air felt thick, suffocating. Suddenly, the whisper came again, soft but clear, curling around him like a cold, invisible hand. "We're behind you." The words sent a shockwave of terror through his body, and this time he didn't hesitate. His feet moved on their own, and he spun around, his flashlight swinging wildly in the dark. The beam danced across the trees, the ground, the space around him, but there was nothing there, nothing at all, just the dense, oppressive darkness. Robert's heart thudded painfully in his chest, and he took several steps back, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to flicker and shift. The whisper had been so close, too close. It had felt like something was right behind him, breathing down his neck. But when he turned around, there was nothing, no one. His mind raced. Was it possible that he was losing his mind? That the isolation of the woods had begun to get to him? That the stress of being alone, the silence, the isolation, it was all playing tricks on him? He gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to steady himself. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and he could feel the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. He forced himself to take slow, deliberate steps forward, trying to push through the panic. The silence stretched on, the darkness closing in. Every crackling twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep, like something moving just out of his reach. The world around him felt distorted, as if reality itself was warping, bending, stretching in ways it wasn't meant to. He stopped. His mind was spinning, a whirlwind of thoughts and questions, none of them making sense. He'd never felt this kind of fear before, not like this. It wasn't just the fear of something chasing him. It was the fear of something that knew him, knew what he had said, what he had thought, and it was watching him, waiting. The whisper came again, this time faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice he recognized, yet it was somehow all too familiar. "I'm here." Robert's heart skipped a beat. He could feel it, a weight, a pressure settling into the air around him. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the forest. This was something else, something alive, something that had been listening, watching, waiting for him to make a move. His eyes darted around, scanning the trees, the bushes, the ground beneath his feet. But again, there was nothing. The beam of his flashlight quivered in his hand, trembling as though it too felt the weight of the presence closing in. He took a slow step backward, instinctually drawing closer to the campfire he had left behind. It was small now, the flames barely flickering in the wind, but it was something. It was light, a barrier. But the whispers weren't gone. They weren't fading. They grew louder, insistent. They echoed in his mind. They repeated his words from earlier, his thoughts, his actions. Each repetition was a strange kind of mockery. It was like the forest was mocking him, repeating everything he had done, everything he had said, as if it knew all of his secrets, all of his thoughts. "I'm here," the voice repeated, this time tinged with something darker, something that didn't belong. His feet carried him backward without thought, stumbling toward the firelight. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to escape. But escape from what? From the voices? From the forest itself? As the whispers reached a fever pitch, Robert spun once more, his heart pounding in his chest. But this time, when he turned, the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. It came from all sides now, circling him like a trap. No matter where he looked, the voices were there, their presence, their words pressed in on him, smothering him. "We're here," they repeated, each word sinking into his skin, crawling beneath it like an infection. Robert's mind reeled. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He wasn't imagining it. He couldn't be. The voices, his own words, they were too real, too clear. "We're behind you." The final whisper echoed in his ears like a cruel final warning. His blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone for a long time. This time, Robert didn't even think. He ran. His legs moved faster than his brain could keep up with, his body driven by a sheer need to escape. His feet pounded against the forest floor, his breath ragged in his throat as he sprinted through the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of him. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All he could think about was getting away from those whispers, from whatever had been following him, whatever had been repeating his words, whatever had been behind him. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he pushed himself, the whispers followed him. They echoed in his ears, relentless, taunting. "We're behind you." They were still behind him, always behind him. Robert's legs burned with the effort, his chest heaving as he stumbled through the dense underbrush. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to amplify the shadows around him. The trees stretched high above, their skeletal branches weaving together like twisted hands, blocking the moonlight and turning the world around him into a labyrinth of darkness. Every few steps he would glance behind him, desperate to see nothing, desperate to prove to himself that he had outrun whatever had been chasing him, whatever had been whispering his thoughts, repeating his words. But The forest was empty. No one was there. No one was watching him. But the whispers, those whispers, hadn't stopped. They were in his head now, as if they were following him everywhere like a constant hum in the back of his mind. His name, his words, repeating, mocking. "We're behind you," they hissed in his mind, growing louder with every passing second. Their voices were no longer just an echo. They were part of him, inside of him. He couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape them. They were all around him, inside him, suffocating him. He didn't even know where he was running anymore. He could hear the crunching of his footsteps, but it was as if he was running in place, as though the forest itself had become a trap, keeping him here, trapping him in the endless cycle of whispers. Finally, in the darkness, he saw it, a clearing ahead. The pale light of the moon illuminated the edge of the forest, offering him a glimpse of freedom. He pushed himself harder, his heart racing, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The clearing was his only hope. If he could reach it, maybe the whispers would stop. Maybe the oppressive weight of the forest would lift. But as he neared the edge of the clearing, something made him stop dead in his tracks. He skidded to a halt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The moonlight illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the clearing, its silhouette sharp against the pale light. Robert's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he thought his mind had broken entirely. The figure was tall, impossibly tall. Its form was human, yet its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its head unnaturally large. The face was a blur, like a smear of dark, shifting shadows. No eyes, no features, just a dark void that seemed to pulse and breathe with its own life. Robert stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. His legs felt like lead, his body refusing to move. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that filled the air now was worse, more suffocating, more oppressive. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, waiting, watching. And then in that horrible, heart-stopping silence, Robert realized something. The whispers weren't gone. They hadn't been behind him, following him at all. They had been in front of him all along. The figure, the thing in the clearing, was the source of the whispers. The thing that had been mimicking him, repeating his thoughts, his words. The forest hadn't been alive. It had been a conduit for something far worse, something that had been feeding on him. His mind shattered with the realization. The figure moved then slowly, impossibly slow, its limbs stretching and bending in ways that defied nature. Robert's stomach turned, his pulse hammering in his chest. His body screamed for him to run, to turn and flee into the darkness, but he couldn't. His feet were frozen to the earth, and his eyes couldn't look away from the figure that had been stalking him all along. As the thing in the clearing began to advance, Robert felt his breath catch in his throat. It was getting closer, closer with each breath he took. It moved with an eerie, unnatural fluidity, like a creature that wasn't bound by the laws of nature. And then, just as it was within arm's reach, it stopped. The silence was deafening now. The figure stood just inches from him, its face still a void, its presence an overwhelming force that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the clearing. And then, with a voice that wasn't a voice at all, the thing spoke. Do you understand now, Robert? It was the same voice, the same whispers that had haunted him from the moment he had entered the forest. But this time, It wasn't just repeating his words, it was speaking his name, his thoughts, his fears, all of them twisted together into something unrecognizable. Robert's legs buckled beneath him, his body collapsing to the ground as the weight of the realization crushed him. He had been running from something that wasn't just in the forest. It had been in his head, in his very soul, manipulating him, feeding off his fear. The thing crouched down, its face, if it could be called a face, looming over him. Robert could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating him. It was as though the very air had become thick with despair, with horror. The thing's presence filled every corner of the clearing, every inch of the space around him. There was nowhere to run. "We've been behind you all along," it whispered, the words echoing in his mind, filling the empty spaces where his thoughts had been. Robert tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat closed up, his body unable to move. The thing reached out, its long, thin fingers brushing against his skin. It was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, colder than the depths of winter, colder than death itself. And then, as if all at once, it began to fade. The thing, the presence, the forest itself, it all began to dissolve, crumbling into nothingness. The trees, the shadows, the whispers, they were all gone, swallowed by the dark void that had appeared in place of the clearing. Robert's mind reeled, his thoughts a blur as the world around him shifted. The ground beneath him vanished, the sky above him turning black. There was nothing, no sound, no light, no movement, just him, alone, and the feeling of something watching him from the darkness. And then, in the distance, he heard it, the whisper, soft and insistent, but not a voice. No, this time it was a presence, a force reaching out to him. "We're still behind you,"